Imagine a world where everyone spoke the same language. No translation. No misunderstanding. One tongue, one speech, one way of thinking. Genesis chapter 11 says that world existed. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And then, humanity built something that would change everything. Genesis 11, verses 1 through 9. Let me read it in full. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks, and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone, and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. The text itself contains a linguistic clue. The name Babel, in Hebrew, sounds like the Hebrew verb balal, which means to confuse or to mix. It's a wordplay. Babel equals confusion. This episode will investigate 3 questions. Question 1. Was the Tower of Babel a real structure? We'll examine archaeological evidence from Babylon, including a recently returned artifact that changes what we know about the tower's appearance. Question 2. Did languages really diversify suddenly, or gradually? We'll explore what linguists have discovered about the origins of language families, and whether a confusion event is even scientifically possible. Question 3. How do other ancient cultures tell this story? Because the Tower of Babel isn't unique. Civilizations around the world have myths about towers to heaven, and their collapse. Let's start where the story begins. Shinar, the land of Babylon, and a structure called Etemenanki. Etemenanki. In Sumerian, the name means house of the foundation of heaven on earth. A ziggurat. A massive, stepped temple tower at the heart of ancient Babylon, and the most likely inspiration for the Tower of Babel. It stood beside the Esagila, the temple of Marduk, Babylon's patron god. Together, they formed the religious center of the city, the axis mundi, the point where heaven and earth connected. According to a late Babylonian tablet copied at Uruk, Etemenanki had 7 terraces. The base was approximately 91 meters by 91 meters, about 300 feet on each side. The total height? Also around 91 meters. A perfect cube rising from the Mesopotamian plain. In 1913, German archaeologist Robert Koldewey excavated the site. He found the foundation. The base measured 91.5 by 91.66 meters, almost exactly matching the ancient tablet's description. The structure had a mud brick core, about 60 by 60 meters, encased in a 15-meter thick mantle of baked brick. Staircases connected the terraces. Gates aligned with the Esagila temple complex. It was real, massive, precisely engineered. Today, almost nothing remains. Centuries of erosion, looting, and war reduced Etemenanki to channels and low mounds. But the archaeological record is clear. This tower existed. And in December 2023, something remarkable happened. A black stone stele, known as the Tower of Babylon Stele, was returned to the Iraq Museum in Baghdad. The stele dates to the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II, around 600 BCE. It shows the king standing beside a depiction of Etemenanki, both a front view and a ground plan. The inscription identifies the structure explicitly, Etemenanki, the tower at Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar's inscription reads, "Etemenanki, the ziggurat of Babylon, I made anew. I raised its top to heaven." He describes rebuilding the tower, glazing its facade, completing what earlier kings had started. This stele is critical. It gives us the most detailed ancient image of the tower's appearance, and it matches the archaeological footprint almost perfectly. Front-facing staircases. 7 terraces. Monumental scale. The Tower of Babel wasn't myth. It was this. But what were ziggurats? They weren't tombs like Egyptian pyramids. They were temple towers. Each major Mesopotamian city had one. Borsippa, a Kharkov, platforms for the gods to descend and meet humanity. In Babylonian cosmology, the ziggurat represented the sacred mountain. The base was the earthly realm. The summit was the threshold of heaven. The terraces were the stages between. The Babylonian creation epic, Enuma Elish, describes the Esagila temple and Etemenanki as the point where a straight line connected earth and heaven. Not metaphorically. Literally, in their worldview. Now we read Genesis 11, "Come, let us build a tower with its top in the heavens." The Tower of Babel wasn't a fantasy. It was a ziggurat. And Etemenanki fits every detail. So, archaeology confirms, the tower was real. But what about the second part of the story? The language confusion. To understand whether languages could suddenly diversify, we first need to understand how languages normally change. Take Latin. 2,000 years ago, Latin was spoken across the Roman Empire. But as Rome fell and regions isolated, Latin split into Italian, Spanish, French, Portuguese, Romanian. This process took centuries. Not overnight. Not in a single generation. Linguists call this language divergence, when a parent language branches into daughter languages. The question is, does this always happen gradually? Or could there be sudden, catastrophic language events? The largest language family on Earth is Indo-European. It includes English, Spanish, Hindi, Persian, Russian, Greek, languages spoken by nearly half the world's population. And here's the key, all these languages descend from a common ancestor. Proto-Indo-European. Pi. A language spoken somewhere around 4000 to 6000 BCE. Where was it spoken? Linguists debate two main theories. The Anatolian hypothesis, PIE originated in modern-day Turkey and spread with early agriculture. The steppe hypothesis, PIE originated on the Pontic-Caspian steppe and spread with horse domestication and bronze technology. In 2013, researchers at the University of Auckland used Bayesian phylogenetic modeling, the same technique used to trace virus evolution, to reconstruct IE language history. They analyzed 103 ancient and modern languages, tracked cognates, modeled divergence times. Their conclusion: Indo-European diversification happened gradually, over millennia. Major subfamily splits occurred between 4000 and 6000 years ago. Within-branch diversification continued from 2000 to 4500 years ago. No sudden event. No catastrophic split. Just slow, incremental change as populations migrated and isolated. But let's zoom out further. Indo-European is just one language family. There are others. Sino-Tibetan, Afro-Asiatic, Niger-Congo, Austronesian, Uralic. Around 140 language families worldwide. So here's the big question. Do all these families descend from one original human language? This is called the monogenesis hypothesis. One origin. One proto-language. The alternative is polygenesis. The idea that language evolved independently in multiple human populations. Mainstream historical linguistics doesn't take a strong position. Why? Because reconstructing language beyond about 6,000 to 8,000 years is nearly impossible. Cognates fade. Sound changes obscure connections. The signal-to-noise ratio collapses. Some researchers propose macrofamilies, groupings like Nostratic, which would link Indo-European, Uralic, Altaic, and others. But these proposals remain controversial. Most linguists consider them speculative. So, does Genesis 11 verse 1, "The whole earth had one language," align with linguistic science? Maybe. If we're talking about deep prehistory, before 10,000 BCE, before agriculture, when human populations were small and interconnected. But by the time Babylon existed, around 2000 BCE, languages had already diversified into dozens of distinct families. So if the Tower of Babel story is historical, it can't be describing the origin of language diversity. It would have to be describing something else. Let's take the Genesis account seriously for a moment. Could there be a scenario where language suddenly becomes confused within a population? Scenario 1, rapid immigration. Imagine Babylon as a cosmopolitan hub. People from across Mesopotamia, Anatolia, the Levant, different languages converging on one city. For a time, a trade pigeon develops. Everyone can communicate. Then, political collapse. The city fractures. Groups revert to their native languages. To an observer, it would feel like sudden confusion, even though the diversity was always there, just suppressed by a common lingua franca. Scenario 2, Scribal language versus spoken language. We know from cuneiform records that Akkadian was the written administrative language across much of the ancient Near East, but people spoke dozens of local dialects. If scribal culture collapsed, say, due to invasion or economic crash, written uniformity would vanish, exposing the underlying linguistic diversity. Scenario 3, Divine intervention. Or, if one accepts the literal biblical account, God directly altered human cognition. This isn't testable scientifically, but it is what the text says. So the linguistic evidence gives us three possibilities. The story is symbolic, a mythological explanation for why humans speak different languages. The story preserves a cultural memory of migration and linguistic fragmentation, but telescopes centuries of change into a single narrative event. The story describes a supernatural intervention that left no trace in the linguistic record because it operated outside natural processes. All three are coherent. Which one you accept depends on your starting assumptions. Here's where it gets fascinating. The Tower of Babel isn't the only tower to heaven story. Cultures around the world, separated by oceans and millennia, tell versions of this myth. The Maya built pyramid temples as sacred mountains connecting earth and sky. The Temple of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza. The Temple of Inscriptions at Palenque. The Egyptians built pyramids as stairways to the heavens, specifically, pathways for the pharaoh's soul to ascend to the stars. Angkor Wat in Cambodia represents Mount Meru, the cosmic axis in Hindu and Buddhist cosmology. Chinese pagodas served as vertical links between Earth and the celestial realm. The pattern repeats: build upward, reach the gods, bridge the gap between mortal and divine. But there's one story that's particularly close to the Tower of Babel. It comes from Sumer, older than the Hebrew Bible by more than 1,000 years. It's called In Merkur and the Lord of Aratta. The story describes a time when the whole universe, the people in unison, to Enlil in one tongue gave praise. One language. Unified humanity. Sound familiar? Then, the god Enki, Lord of wisdom and language, intervenes. The speech of mankind was one. But then Enki, the Lord of abundance, changed the speech in their mouths, brought contention into it. Compare that to Genesis 11 verse 7, "Come, let us go down," and there confused their language. The parallels are undeniable. One language becomes many. Divine intervention. Linguistic confusion. So did the Hebrews borrow from the Sumerians? Maybe. Or both stories preserve a shared cultural memory from deeper Mesopotamian history. Or, and this is the possibility both traditions would affirm, the event actually happened, and different cultures remembered it differently. There's a deeper pattern here. Anthropologists call it the axis mundi, the world axis. The cosmic pillar. The center of the universe. In Norse mythology, Yggdrasil, the world tree, connects the 9 realms. In Greek mythology, Mount Olympus is the throne of the gods, linking earth and sky. In Jewish tradition, Mount Sinai, the Temple Mount, and, symbolically, Jacob's ladder serve this function. Why does this archetype appear everywhere? One explanation: it's a human psychological universal. We look up. The sky is unknowable, infinite, sacred. We build upward to reach it. Towers, mountains, trees, all symbols of transcendence. So when the Babylonians built Etemenanki, house of the foundation of heaven on earth, they weren't doing anything unique. They were enacting an ancient human impulse. The question Genesis 11 raises is, what happens when that impulse goes too far? Let's bring science into the picture. Around 2200 BCE, roughly the time some biblical chronologies date the Tower of Babel, something happened. A climate event called the 4.2 kiloyear event. Evidence from ice cores, lake sediments, and speleothems shows a period of intense aridification. Civilizations collapsed. The Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia. The Old Kingdom in Egypt. The early Bronze Age cities in the Levant. Cities were abandoned. Trade networks broke down. Populations migrated. Could this explain the Tower of Babel story? Here's a scenario. Babylon, as a regional hub, draws people from multiple linguistic backgrounds during prosperous times. Then drought hits. Resources collapse. The city fragments. People scatter back to their homelands. From the perspective of someone living through it, the unified world of one language would seem to suddenly shatter. But there's a problem with this neat explanation. Recent multi-proxy studies show the 4.2 Ka event was regionally variable. Northern Mesopotamia saw urban expansion even during the drought. Southern areas were hit harder. It wasn't a single, global catastrophe. It was complex, uneven, and drawn out over decades. So while climate stress might have contributed to migration and cultural fragmentation, it doesn't map cleanly onto a single, tower event. What about population genetics? Can DNA tell us anything about sudden human dispersal? Studies of Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA show that modern human populations experienced several migration waves out of Africa and across Eurasia. The major dispersals happened long before Babylon. Out of Africa, 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. Into Europe and Asia, 40,000 to 50,000 years ago. Agricultural expansions, 10,000 to 8,000 years ago. By the Bronze Age, when Babel would have occurred, humans were already spread across 6 continents. There's no genetic signature of a sudden, Babel-scale dispersal around 2200 BCE. What does show up in the genetic record is smaller-scale regional migrations. Indo-European steppe pastoralists moving into Europe and India. Semitic peoples moving through the Levant and Mesopotamia. These could contribute to localized linguistic diversity. But they don't support a single, catastrophic, scattering event. Not exactly. It disproves a global, sudden dispersal of all humanity from a single point in the 3rd millennium BCE. But it doesn't disprove a regional, localized event that ancient observers described as global because their world was Mesopotamia. If the Tower of Babel story preserves a memory of Babylon's rise and fall as a cosmopolitan center, the scientific evidence doesn't contradict that. It just reframes the scale. Let's return to the text and examine both readings. Genesis 11 describes a specific historical event. Humanity, unified in language and purpose, settles in Shinar, Babylon. They build a tower to reach heaven. God intervenes, not out of jealousy, but out of mercy. Nothing they propose to do will be impossible for them. Unchecked technological ambition, unified by language and will, leads to hubris, to catastrophe, to self-destruction. So God confuses their language and scatters them, preserving humanity by limiting its power. On this reading, Etemenanki is the tower. The confusion was supernatural. The scattering was global. The fact that we can't find linguistic or genetic evidence of a sudden 2200 BCE dispersal doesn't disprove it, it just means the intervention operated outside natural processes, leaving no fingerprint for science to detect. Genesis 11 is a cultural memory of Babylon's role as a cosmopolitan center, and its eventual decline. For centuries, Babylon was the hub of the ancient Near East. Akkadian was the lingua franca. Cuneiform was the script. Trade networks stretched from the Mediterranean to the Indus. Then came collapse. Political, economic, environmental. Empires fell. Cities were abandoned. Populations scattered. The unity broke. The story of linguistic confusion appears in Sumerian texts predating Genesis by over a millennium. So the Hebrews likely inherited and adapted an older Mesopotamian tradition. They placed it at Babylon, the most iconic ziggurat city. They gave it theological meaning. Human pride leads to divine judgment. But the core memory is historical. Babylon really was a place of one language. It really did fragment. The story is symbolic truth, not scientific history. But here's a third option. What if both are true, in different senses? Etemenanki was real. Babylon was cosmopolitan. Multiple languages coexisted under a common trade tongue. Then, crisis. Drought, invasion, economic collapse, take your pick. The city fragments. Languages separate. People scatter. A literal biblical reader could say, God used natural processes, climate, migration, political collapse, to achieve his purpose. The confusion wasn't magic words scrambling overnight. It was the withdrawal of sustaining grace that had kept the unity intact. An academic reader could say, the story remembers real events, but interprets them theologically. The fragmentation happened. The Hebrew saw divine purpose in it. This is what historians of religion call convergence. The mythological and the historical aren't opposites. They're layers. The tower was real. The scattering was real. Whether God's hand moved in it, invisibly, through natural means or supernaturally, is a question archaeology can inform but not answer. So, what do we know? We know Etemenanki existed. 91 by 91 meters. 7 terraces. Excavated by Coldway. Depicted on Nebuchadnezzar's stele. Called, House of the Foundation of Heaven on Earth. We know language diversification happened. But gradually, over millennia, not suddenly in a single event. We know Babylon was cosmopolitan, a hub where languages, peoples, and cultures mixed. And we know it collapsed multiple times, scattering populations across the Near East. We know the story is older than Genesis. Sumerian texts describe Enki confusing languages. The Tower of Babel draws on deep Mesopotamian tradition. And we know the story resonates. Because humans across history have built towers to the gods, and question what happens when we reach too far. The Tower of Babel story isn't really about language. It's about ambition, unity, power, and limits. Come, let us build a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. Make a name, achieve fame, transcend mortality, become like gods. We're still building towers. Skyscrapers pierce the clouds. Rockets leave the atmosphere. AI promises to break the limits of human cognition. The impulse hasn't changed. The question hasn't changed. Nothing they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Is that a promise? Or a warning? Whether God confused our tongues, or we scattered ourselves, the lesson remains. Some towers are meant to fall. Not because the gods are jealous, but because reaching heaven isn't done with bricks. This has been Underlight Histories. Thank you for watching.